Hi, and welcome to the RRTC webcast on self-determination. I'm Terry Blankenship. Thanks for joining us. Today's webcast will be captioned, so if you need that feature, just click on the captioning link off the webcast page. Also, today's webcast will be archived for you, and we will email you the username and password by tomorrow so you can access it. Our presenter today is Dr. Michael Wehmeyer. He will be joining us from his location at the University of Kansas. Dr. Wehmeyer is an associate professor for the Department of Special Education and the associate director for the Beach Center at the University of Kansas. And he's also the director of the Center on Developmental Disabilities. Michael has focused his work on promoting self-determination for people of all ages. He has authored many articles, chapters, and books on self-determination and other disability-related topics. So let's begin, and we will join Michael at the University of Kansas. Michael?
It's nice to be with you, and I know that many of you, because of my weather-related delays, the previous scheduled time, were able to see my previous broadcast, the webcast, and so that's both an advantage, I think, and a disadvantage. It means I can't say the same things again, but it perhaps give you an opportunity to have spent some time with some of the things that I had to say last time. I'd like to start with an overview, again, not to be too redundant from the previous broadcast, but to kind of articulate a little bit more about what it is that I think self-determination is and what it is I'm going to be talking about. I think it's important at a number of levels. If we don't have a sense of what it is I'm talking about and we're trying to implement in the lives of people with disabilities, we're not going to be as effective as we'd like. On top of that, there is some various uses of the self-determination construct in the field of developmental and cognitive disabilities that I think need some clarification, not of the use of the term particularly, but just in the sense of what I'm going to be talking about. If you look at definitions around self-determination, fundamentally you have a personal sense of the construct, which refers to determining as one's own fate or course of action without undue interference or compulsion. It's that personal sense of becoming self-determined, of being a self-determined person that I'm really going to talk about today, and particularly what is the role of vocational rehabilitation in supporting people to be self-determined, to make their own career decisions, to do some of those things. Our work has been in the area of education and how do we promote and enhance the self-determination of children, youth, and indeed adults with disabilities. There is a second meaning of the term that has either a political or a national or political or national context. The slide that was up earlier showed referred to the freedom of a people of a given area to determine their own political status, and it's roughly synonymous with independence. There is a movement in developmental disability services, adult services, within largely context of residential outcomes for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities, but other areas referred to as the self-determination movement and self-determination activities that relate to consumer-controlled funding to purchase based on individual preferences either employment supports or residential living supports. And these involve various means of individualized budgeting and brokerage services and Medicaid waiver issues and others. And I just want to be clear that that's not something I'm going to be dealing with. It is not an area that we've ventured into. I am fully supportive of movements to return control back to consumers by returning funding and enabling them to purchase supports in ways that are consistent with them. But if you're looking for answers around Medicaid waiver and those issues around self-determination, I'm afraid that I'm not going to have those answers. In looking at how we define this sense of self-determination as a personal construct, I think there's a tendency to want to look for synonyms for self-determination. Self-determination is a complex construct and does have some confusing meaning. And I think, there's a tendency to talk about choice as completely synonymous, or decision-making as completely synonymous. I think if you're looking for a synonym for self-determination in terms of this personal sense of the construct, what you're really, the best one in there is that we want to enable people to be self-governing. We want to enable people to exercise control over themselves and to self-regulate their actions toward highly preferred and desired goals and outcomes. So this idea of enabling people to be self-governing, I think, is critical to understanding what we mean when we say we want to promote the self-determination of people within the vocational rehabilitation and other systems. We have, in our own work, we've tried to really get at what self-determination means, and we've hit on or used the idea of causal agency as a critical feature of self-determined behavior. And I want to spend just a moment talking about that, because I think that there are a number of misconceptions, many of which I went through in my previous broadcast, and which I won't go through in detail again. But we have looked at being self-determined as acting as the primary causal agent in one's life and making choices and decisions regarding one's quality of life free from undue external influence or interference. A causal agent is someone who makes or causes things to happen in his or her own life. And I think that's an important distinction, because you'll often hear people characterize self-determination as a number of ways that include doing everything for yourself. I call it the Lone Ranger theory of self-determination. It means you're doing everything for yourself, you're making all your own independent decisions. People usually think of that in the context of more complex decisions, so complex decisions about medical and healthcare issues, or complex decisions about, or the capacity to do complex things like balance a budget and control one's finances completely and absolutely. And I think it's important that we not misinterpret issues of self-determination as simply meaning doing everything yourself. What I have come to believe is that what being self-determined means is really making things happen in your life. And for all of us, whether we have a disability or not, it's the fact that it is a fact that we utilize a lot of different resources to achieve goals and outcomes that are preferred and that are in our best interest. And that what we want to be doing is not doing everything for ourselves, but using the resources that are available to us. And this is equally true, I think, for people with the most with severe disabilities who might not be able to independently manage a budget or make complex decisions. Nonetheless, there are a number of things that we can put into place that enable that person to have greater control in his or her life and to make or to cause things to happen in his or her life. It can be as simple as being supported through some alternative communication system to express a preference, It can be as simple as having multiple opportunities to try different things so that you get a sense of what it is you prefer versus an assumption about what you want to do. And we'll return to this topic later on, but I think it's really important that we understand that being self-determined doesn't mean you're doing everything independently, that it's not equated with a whole host of complex skills and abilities. It is my very strong and firm belief that every human being can become more self-determined, and that those of us whose profession and whose mission is to support people with disabilities to achieve rich, satisfying lives through employment and through other outcomes, there are things that we can do for each individual with whom we work that would enable them to be more self-determined and to be causal agents in their life, to make or to cause things to happen in their lives. So I would ask that you kind of revisit that, and I will probably refer to it again as we go through the remainder of our time together here. I want to talk specifically today about issues around self-determination, rehabilitation, and issues of workplace supports. And I'll start by looking at and very briefly overviewing what the research tells us. And I would preface this by saying that we have too little research and too little good research about some of these things, and there is a need to conduct more and better research around these topics and issues. But I believe that this is an area that's both justified through research outcomes such as those I'll talk about in a minute, but also by our moral and ethical responsibilities as a society. People with disabilities have been clear and unequivocal about their desire for greater control over their life and their destiny, about their desire to have a significant voice in decisions that impact their lives, including decisions about what kind of a job they take and career path. And so I believe that not only is there research, even what limited research exists, to justify our professional focus on this. I think ethically as professionals in listening to people with disabilities, that there is a moral and ethical justification to making a focus on self-determination a core part of rehabilitation and workplace supports. I think you can make an argument quite simply that it may be the most important thing that you do in terms of supporting people. And so let me go through some of the reasons. First of all, if you look at the research in transition services, particularly in research in education, in preparing young people to be adults, there is an emerging but growing database literature support that self-determined young people, self-determined youth, achieve more positive adult outcomes, including better employment-related outcomes and higher wages than youth who are not self-determined. Our own research has looked at outcomes for youth with cognitive disabilities, mental retardation, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities. And in a couple of studies, we have followed up students 1 year after they graduate and then 3 years after they graduate. And in both of those studies, we found very clear evidence that young people who are self-determined and controlling for other factors such as level of ability, cognitive ability, school curriculum and other things, including the number of vocational courses that a student takes, self-determined young people at 1 year out are twice as likely in this study, in our study, to have been employed for pay, and at that time were earning on average $2 an hour more than youth who were in the low self-determination group who were also employed. 3 years out, we found that the employment rates had evened up a little bit for youth who were self-determined in comparison of youth who were not self-determined, but that youth who were self-determined were more likely to be employed in jobs that provided health care, vacation, and other benefits. And so we see definitely very positive employment-related outcomes, as well as 3 years out we saw differences in the number of and the percentage of youth who were living independently. The second fact, I think, is that people who are self-determined, young people who are self-determined, have a higher quality of life. We have done some research looking at the relationship between self-determination and quality of life, and in that study, quality of life, self-determination status was a higher predictor of membership in a high quality of life group than were a number of factors, including IQ score. So it's clear that the educational focus on promoting and enhancing self-determination has positive benefits, and that self-determined young people achieve more positive adult outcomes. In addition, there is really an overwhelming, I would say, or at least compelling database that shows that people with disabilities, including people with the most severe disabilities, can learn self-management strategies, self-regulation strategies that enable them to more independently perform vocational and employment-related tasks. This is not a recent database. In fact, it's a database that really goes back to the 80s, and looking at teaching folks with severe disabilities strategies such as self-instruction, self-monitoring and self-recording, self-evaluation strategies, a number of self-management strategies that have been shown to enable people with even severe disabilities to support themselves in work and employment and vocational settings, and to more independently perform work and employment-related outcomes. One of the areas we've been working in recently is the application of kind of new and emerging technology as a means for young people, adolescents in the transition age, to support themselves using self-management types of strategies in vocational related tasks. For example, we've conducted a couple of studies that have shown that with specially designed software that provides basically a self-instruction strategy, a sequence, young people with cognitive disabilities can become more independent in vocational tasks that involve a number of sequence steps, including steps up to 20 steps in a task. By more independent, what I mean is that students can perform these tasks, these vocational tasks, at a higher rate at a higher percentage of time doing the task correctly, and with less external prompting from a job coach or a teacher or somebody else. And there really is no reason that this is not the same for adults. So when we talk about enhancing the self-determination of people with disabilities in employment-related outcomes, and you think about folks with more severe disabilities, particularly, who you say, well, that it's difficult for that person to independently make complex decisions. Think about the fact that we can use some of these new emerging technologies, palm-top PCs and other technologies that would enable them to self-direct vocational tasks more independently. And I would point to that as an example of how we can enable people to become more self-determined even if they're not completely independent. But similarly, even in the absence of technology, it's clear that we can teach folks to do for themselves what in many cases is done for them, and thus increase and promote their self-determination. Research in rehabilitation itself suggests that VR consumers who are actively involved in their own program planning achieve more positive vocational career and development outcomes. A work by Farley, Bolton, and Parkerson has shown this to be the case, that active involvement in VR planning and decision making resulted in enhanced career development outcomes for VR consumers. Similarly, there's research, Hartnett and colleagues have shown that VR consumers who are actively involved in their program planning are 2 times more likely to have completed the rehabilitation process and earn 2 to 3 times more than people in traditional rehabilitation processes. I think that both of those studies speak to the fact and reinforce the research in transition that people who are actively involved in their vocational planning in the rehabilitation and habilitation process are more likely to experience positive outcomes. I think that's intuitive. I think we most of us believe that if we are working toward goals that we've had a voice in setting, then we're going to achieve more positive outcomes, and we're going to have greater ownership over that. And that's kind of the focus of other reasons, other benefits of promoting. If you look at the research that I've just kind of briefly, obviously, overviewed, what does that relate in terms of the benefits accrued by focusing on self-determination in the context of rehabilitation and workplace supports? Well, folks who are self-determined are going to be better able to set goals based on their own personal preferences, on their own interests, on their own abilities. And I would contend that what that will result in is that folks who are setting goals and identifying potential outcomes based on personal interests and preferences are going to be more likely to stay the course with the training needed, are going to be more likely to achieve positive outcomes in achieving those, as opposed to even a well-intentioned match for job placement that does not adequately take into account. Secondly, people who are self-determined are going to be able to solve problems that come up in their work and their workplace support settings, and they're going to be able to remove barriers to obtaining a preferred job or that second or third job that's better paying or has better benefits. We know, I'm sure the people who are in the audience know that for a great many people with disabilities, it is not problems with job skills, particular employment skills, job skills that result in job loss. It is often social and other problems that arise that result in termination. And people who are better able to solve kind of workday problems that might involve problematic interactions with work colleagues, or just problems about how to do one's task, those folks are going to be better able or more likely to retain their job. Also, we know, we've done some work, and others have done some work, suggesting that many people, particularly people with cognitive disabilities, severe disabilities, once they end up in entry-level positions, they stay there for far too many years. And we know that those are not positions that typically have a living wage associated with them too frequently, or have benefits such as vacation and health care. And if you look at, we did a study with self-advocates from around the nation. These were adults with cognitive disabilities who self-identified themselves as having a cognitive disability, who were actively involved in self-advocacy. And among this group, 80% of folks were employed, which, if you know employment rates of people with cognitive disabilities, is very high. And of those 80%, when we asked them if they were satisfied with their job, An overwhelming 95 to 98% said yes, they were satisfied with their job. If, however, we asked them whether this job that they were currently in was the job that they would most prefer to be in, 75% of these folks said no, there was another job that they would prefer. And when we asked what it was that was keeping them from moving into that job, almost overwhelmingly, it was that they were waiting on their job coach or the VR system or somebody else to find them that better preferred job. People who are self-determined are folks who are better able to take a look at what is available to make the move from the entry-level job to that second, better paying, more highly preferred job. So I think that both for job training and for employment progression and career development, self-determination plays an important role. Another benefit of promoting self-determination in vocational employment related settings is that self-determined people are better able to advocate and more likely to advocate on their own behalf for better jobs or better working conditions. Again, this is both a job retention issue and a job satisfaction issue. And we all know that the employment rehab systems, there simply are not enough resources that a job coach or someone in the system can advocate on behalf of every individual. People have got to be enabled and empowered to advocate on their own behalf, and in so doing are going to be more likely to progress into better jobs, jobs that are more preferred, or are going to be able to remove problems and address problems in those settings. Secondly, they're going to be better able to identify the supports and accommodations they need to succeed. The ADA promises equal non-discrimination to people who are otherwise capable of performing the essential tasks of a job, and fundamentally who can identify the supports and accommodations that they need. Again, the system, it is not the employer's responsibility, but it is the employee's responsibility to be able to identify what particular accommodations. People who are self-determined, who have an awareness of what they do well, what their limitations are, and where they need supports, and who have talked about these issues, are going to be more capable and able to do that. I have, I think, about about 15 minutes. And what I would like to do in that 15 minutes is to go through what I've called 7 principles of promoting self-determination and rehabilitation and employment services. And this is just principles in the sense that if I were to advise you in what to look at, and if I were looking at promoting self-determination and rehabilitation, these are the things that I think that come to the forefront based on my personal experiences with attempting to address these issues. So let me just cover those, and then my understanding is that there will be an opportunity for you to email questions, and if you'd like to follow up with that, I will respond and send additional information. The first principle is that we really do need to ensure consumer control. It remains the case that many, if not most, employment support and rehabilitation services are other-directed. Decisions are by and large made by others, even in progressive settings. We've been working with job placement issues for youth 18 to 21, and many of the people we work with are very skilled, people who are very good at going out and identifying potential work sites, and they have, by and large, worked with the adolescent, this 18 to 21-year-old, to determine what preferences they have. And they work very hard at matching the available job sites to what student preferences are. But the fact of the matter is, if we start with job site development and we go out and we develop sites, and then we come back and we say, that here's what's available, which one do you want best, we can't be assured that that's going to really be what a student really preferred. And I'll relate a story that I think illustrates that later on. We need to have active involvement of people, of the consumer of the services in the planning, the decision-making process, indeed in terms of job development and other issues. Now, I would point out that this doesn't mean that people with disabilities do everything themselves. As I've suggested before, being self-determined is not equivalent to doing everything for yourselves. We can actively involve in a meaningful way people in the decision-making process and in program implementation, and we can do a much more effective job, I think, of identifying individual preferences, interests, and strengths, and starting with those preferences, interests, and strengths to then go out and do the job development, as opposed to simply matching already identified job sites with preferences. Let me give you a quick illustration of that. We have worked with, as I mentioned, young people 18 to 21 transitioning, and the particular case example is related to a rec leisure outcome, and a recreation leisure outcome, and not an employment outcome, but we've seen similar things occur. We've worked with these young people to self-direct the planning, decision-making, goal-setting process, leading to setting goals and designing programs for employment, recreation, leisure, independent living outcomes. And one young man we were working with, in looking at what his preferences and interests were related to the area of recreational leisure, indicated that he was interested in becoming a storm chaser. For those of you in the Great Plains states, you will know that a storm chaser are folks who are hooked to the Weather Channel and frequently go out as tornadoes and other severe weather develops, and literally chases those storms to capture the moment when tornadoes emerge and hit. Now, we knew that this young man's parents were not going to be interested in him becoming a storm chaser, but in working with him, we identified the fact that there were, in fact, in this metropolitan area, there were clubs that met on a monthly basis of people who shared this interest of storm chasing. And we worked with this young man, supported him to contact a member of one of these clubs, and with really minimal effort, he was linked with these clubs, and this club became a great support for this recreation leisure preference. I would also note that it's through connections such as that he might find a job related to this particular preference and interest. I will assure you that had it been our responsibility to develop this program for him, none of us probably would have come up with the idea of storm chasing as a meaningful outcome. So the landscape changes dramatically when you involve people in a meaningful way in planning and decision making. And I would just encourage you to be very systematic about determining a person's preferences. And that means for people with more severe disabilities, with limited communication skills, it means doing things beyond just perhaps interviewing a family member. That's an important component, but a lot of times if people haven't had experiences related to particular job classes or employment options, they don't know that it's a preference. So there are a number of ways using technology, switch preferences by observation methodologies, looking at where people, how they literally spend their time, that we can get a better sense of preferences and interests. So we need to support people to make choices, and we need to be systematic about that, and we need to provide as many options as we can that would enable people to do that. As I've indicated, people with severe disabilities may need greater experiences with more options. They may have had very limited experiences with options in the past. and we may need to be more systematic in assessing those preferences. And then, again, we need to use multiple means, not just a single checklist or something else to determine consumer job and vocational preferences. I would also emphasize that making a choice simply involves having a preference, so you have to know what you like, and then communicating that in some way. And for many people with more severe disabilities, it's not that they don't know what they like, it's that they don't have a good way to communicate that. And so there may be people with whom you work who really do need some focused opportunities and supports to enable them to more effectively communicate. And in some cases that may involve assistive communication or alternative or augmentative communication devices. The third principle I would advocate is that we need to support people to set and attain employment goals. Obviously this is a component of actively involving people and ensuring consumer control. Self-determined behavior is fundamentally goal-oriented behavior. And we need to support people to set long and short-term goals based on their preferences, interests, and abilities. And there are a number of ways that we can do that systematically. At the very least, goal setting does involve indications of preferences. And also an important aspect of goal-oriented behavior is that we track our progress toward a goal. And there are many ways that we can support people to track their own progress toward an employment goal. I've referred previously to self-monitoring, self-evaluation strategies. We've worked with people with very severe disabilities to set up self-monitoring strategies that enable them to track their progress toward employment and other related goals. So it is limited only by the creativity of the people supporting this person. A fourth principle, if you will, is that we need to support people to identify and solve barriers and problems. We need to enable people to identify problems that keep them from attaining a preferred job or advancing. And we need to take a look at whether that problem resolution is really a function of teaching or supporting the person to do something versus removing barriers in the environment. And I think this is an important note, and that is that we're moving to models of defining disability that don't look at disability as a problem within the individual that needs to be fixed or repaired or cured or whatever else. We look at models of disability, including the World Health Organization's classification system, that look at disability as an outcome of the relationship, the interaction between a person's abilities and limitations and the context in which that person is operating. We are often able to ensure success by focusing our attention on that context, on the workplace setting, through accommodations and through adaptations. And I think this field's history with supported employment is really leads the way in understanding how we can modify environments and do job carving, job sharing, the types of things that we know how to do. So it's important that we support people, and in a lot of ways you learn to solve problems by solving problems, and many people with disabilities are not provided the opportunity to solve even small problems. So again, the objective here is not to ensure that people can solve the most complex problem in the world, but in fact that they can participate in problem solving and perhaps become better problem solvers. The fifth principle I would point out is that we need to really be active in supporting consumer self-advocacy. We need to ensure that consumers know their rights, workplace rights, but also rights within your agency and within the supports that are provided to you. We need to provide folks with a safe process for expressing grievances and ensuring that because they complain about their job coach doesn't mean that they will then be booted out of the agency. we need to support active, meaningful consumer representation throughout our agencies and our support mechanisms, so that people have a voice, that someone they can go to that doesn't feel like that they're threatening their own job and support systems. I think as we do these things, and we also need to support individual self-advocacy skills, but I think the focus I'm thinking here is that we really need to ensure consumer control by ensuring that consumers have processes within our own agencies that enable them to ensure that they're getting their rights are protected and that there's processes in place. This may not be a big deal most of the time, but but when it is, it can be a very big deal. The sixth principle I would point out is that we need to ensure meaningful involvement in the decision-making process. Decision-making is a process. It's comprised of steps, and virtually everyone can learn to participate in some portion of some of those steps, including identifying what options exist out for employment-related supports, workplace supports. What are some of the consequences of each of those options? What is the value of or importance of a particular option to us? That's a part of the decision-making process that moves beyond just an establishment of a fact to the injection of personal preferences. And a great, there's the standing stereotype of midlife crisis for many men is to go out and buy a red sports car, but that may not be the best decision in terms of one's insurance and impact on financial stuff. They're often not the safest vehicles, so that may not be. There's a number of reasons, consequences, but in the end, it's our own personal preferences that override that and our own values. And so we need to make sure that the values held by people with disabilities are taken into account in making decisions. And sometimes that means that the decisions may not be the most logical. These are not decisions that Spock would make necessarily. These are decisions that are made based on what the person's preferences and values are. These may be religious values, they may be cultural values, and personal values, familial values. And then we need to integrate these into the decisions about the course of action. We need to make sure that people have all the information they need to make truly informed decisions. And that's a process that if people are actively engaged will be much easier. Then the final principle I would point out is that we simply need to focus on ability and not disability. We don't need to do for people what they can do for themselves. And there just are a lot of ways, as you look at the folks with whom you work and whom you support, that you can identify ways that they can do for themselves. They can become more self-determined to do things for themselves. It may be small, it may look like an inconsequential step. It's my belief that for most people with disabilities, they will tell you it's not inconsequential. Anything you can do that enhances the opportunity for people with disabilities to exert control and to be causal agents in their lives is a very positive step forward. And the more you can move toward the workplace supports focusing on enabling people to do those and focusing on these principles, I think not only will consumers be more satisfied, they will be more successful in both job outcome, retention, advancement, career development, and that means that we're going to be more successful, as well as, frankly, doing the right thing. So I'll look forward to interacting with you via email. Again, thank you for your forbearance as we've tried to work out this webcast, and now I'll turn it back over to you, Terry. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this webcast on self-determination, rehabilitation, and workplace supports. You may email your questions throughout the week to Michael, and there's an email link off of the webcast page. And don't forget, we'll send you the archive information by tomorrow so you can access it. Thanks again for participating.